Now, of course, it is possible to resist a social movement. And this will in many ways take us back to basic theories about collective behavior, why people act the way they do and make the decisions they do in groups. Generally speaking, if one group of people want to do what they can to affect change, there's usually going to be another group of people who don't want the change to occur. This is just common sense. If everybody was in agreement, there'd be no need for change, for a movement of any kind. And your text makes the very simple but realistic point that the people who are going to resist a social movement the most are those who will benefit the most from it failing. In Tiananmen Square in China in 1989, the ruling government resisted the protest the way they did because the ruling government had the most to lose, had the protesters been successful. Every facet of the civil rights movement was resisted by white Americans who did not want their privileged position to change. They liked the way things were. So of what we've discussed so far, the first thing you'll probably think of in relation to resisting social movements are the obvious examples like revolutions, right? Because they seek to change the society as a whole. And because of this, most will certainly face the most resistance from a segment of the population. But resistance to social movements can be kind of classified in different ways. The first kind of resistance is ridicule. Just what it says, as simple as that. Making fun of the movement overall and its goals, making snide comments about it in general, or about specific people involved in it. Make fun of the people who participate in it, make fun of the leaders, ridicule everything about the movement and everybody who participates. And we see this all the time. Political satirists, everyday newspapers, news people. And because if you ridicule it and make fun of it enough, and enough people do this enough, eventually it might undermine the movement as a whole in the general consciousness of the rest of society. Just think of the news and what we see online. If you constantly see information posted in a positive light, that will eventually work its way into your consciousness. But it's the same if you constantly see negative information. Just looking at the social movements I've used as examples so far in this particular class. Some people ridicule the Black Lives Matter movement and carry signs or wear t-shirts that say all lives matter or white lives matter. From their perspective, thinking it's stupid to just say that Black lives matter. And they don't realize that by doing that, they're proving the point of the Black Lives Matter movement. This slowly but surely spread online in certain circles, which resulted in creating a kind of secondary movement of all lives matter, which is much, much smaller. And when you look at the effect of ridicule on social movements, it's not just as simple as that, ridicule. Because often the ridicule is really calculated in nature, and it's designed to try to bring about a specific result. So what I mean is that it's not just as straightforward as saying something stupid or dumb. Often ridicule is specifically worded to plant the seed of doubt with something. Donald Trump is an absolute expert on this. Whether you like him as a person or not, whether you agree with his political positions or not, he really is an expert in using social media to ridicule people and policies opposed to him. And in ridiculing them, what he does is present a different perception of them, and he begins the spread of misinformation. He's made use of social media to do this in a way nobody has before. So there was a reporter that disagreed with him. This was several years ago. And the reporter happens to be handicapped. And Trump openly mocked him, imitating him. He openly mocked Greta Thunberg, who is a young environmentalist. He sent a tweet saying Biden for nursing home resident, trying to ridicule Biden because of his age. Now, another way to resist a social movement is to co-opt it, take over the people in it. To deal with the social movement by kind of taking it over for yourself, and in doing that, neutralizing it. But let's acknowledge something here. So there seems to be some dishonesty, or at least the appearance of dishonesty and sneakiness automatically implied here. So how would you co-opt a social movement? Well, one way to do this is to create something similar in appearance that's actually the opposite. So select a similar name that's deliberately misleading. And your textbook gives an example of this: the Southern California Air Quality Alliance, or the Greener Earth Society. The Greener Earth Society was actually formed by a group of utility and electric companies, exactly the people that environmental groups would be in opposition of. But the word greener earth, well, if you're talking about greener, it means being more environmentally friendly. And even their symbol here, you can see it looks like they're environmentally friendly. As I've already said, a more recent example is the Black Lives Matter movement that was co-opted, or they at least attempted to co-opt it, by the White Lives Matter movement, and keeping it as similar as possible. Sometimes commercialization will co-opt a social movement, like when it seemed like you could not buy anything unless it had been pinked in support of breast cancer. So one of the phrases used to describe this is pink washing. But this doesn't always go as planned. And Pepsi found this out the hard way when it released a commercial suggesting that Pepsi may be the secret to world peace and racial unity. In the ad, protesters are instantly kind of placated when Kendall Jenner hands a police officer a Pepsi. Seriously, I'm not making it up. Now, part of me wonders if part of the inspiration for the Pepsi commercial was the old Coke commercial from the 70s. I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. Please don't laugh. I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company. I should have put the link here. Again, please don't laugh. But this was an extremely popular commercial that was remade over and over by Coke. It was reissued several times in the 70s and 80s. So maybe that was part of Pepsi's inspiration, putting out a commercial based in some way on Pepsi positively affecting racial inequality. But because of where the United States is right now, with racial inequality and police brutality, with some people literally losing their lives, it was a pretty poor decision. And I think a good way to put this is that the company really did not read the room properly. They didn't read the social atmosphere of the United States very well. And this tweet that I've put here, and to think all Rodney King needed to avoid that beating was a Pepsi, that really summarizes how well this attempt to co-opt the Black Lives Matter movement was really received. Another way to co-opt a movement is to maybe get some of the leaders of the movement to join the other side, or at least to have the appearance of joining the other side. And that would be absolutely huge, wouldn't it? To have one of the leaders of a social movement not just leave it, but maybe become part of something that opposes the movement or is in conflict with it in some way. So I've already talked about Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Candy Lightner, who was the founder, started the organization when her daughter was killed at the age of 13 by a repeat offender. The man who hit her was driving drunk and had a very long record of doing so. In fact, the accident when he killed her daughter was his 5th accident in 4 years. And he had only been out of jail for 2 days when this occurred. Within a week of her daughter's funeral, she started Mothers Against Drunk Driving with the goal of putting a human face on the victims of drunk drivers so that they'd be more than just numbers, more than just statistics. She wanted to raise the minimum drinking age in each state and to increase the minimum punishments administered by the court. And when this became especially important when she found out that the man who killed her daughter, who was literally passed out when he hit her, then woke up and drove away, would likely get absolutely no jail time. She quit her job and she got organized. She got really organized. And together with another mother whose daughter had been hit by a drunk driver but lived, started lobbying the government. So the other woman, her name was Cindy Lamb. She was the mom of Laura Lamb, who was an infant. A drunk driver hit the car she was in, driven by her mom, and Laura Lamb became the nation's first quadriplegic infant. And she later died when she was 6 because of complications related to this. So these two women started lobbying the government at every level, at one point even visiting her state governor's office on a daily basis, until he agreed to launch a state commission on drunk driving. Both lectured, lobbied, gave interviews, became activists in every sense of the word, and as they did this, gaining support, she helped get new anti-drunk driving legislation passed in individual states and nationally. She helped raise the national drinking age in the US to 21. And then her daughter, who was killed, Carrie, was actually a twin, and her twin started Students Against Drunk Driving. And before this was done, as I've said, people really didn't take drunk driving seriously. Comedians would regularly impersonate drunk drivers on stage because it was considered funny. But in 1985, Candy Lightner left Mothers Against Drunk Driving. She said it was because she felt the organization has shifted its focus from not drunk driving to trying to influence people to limit their alcohol intake altogether, which she didn't agree with. She said she didn't like the path MADD was taking. And then 4 years after leaving Mothers Against Drunk Driving, she agreed to work as a lobbyist for the liquor industry, specifically the American Beverage Institute. This is also the organization that openly fought Mothers Against Drunk Driving when it tried to enact tougher drunk driving laws. But what she said was that she didn't see the liquor industry as the enemy. She said, "They're just as affected by drunk driving as anybody else. Drunk driving certainly doesn't enhance their business," end quote. So what she was doing for them specifically was that other organizations were trying to lower the alcohol level needed to be classified as impaired. At that time, it was 0.1 blood alcohol, and they were trying to lobby it for it to be 0.08, and she disagreed with that. And this really, really affected the reputation of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, as well as her own. A lot of people viewed her as a sellout. She kind of sold her good name, her reputation. She sold her credibility. And you might imagine being co-opted from a social movement to then take on a completely different position is not something that happens all the time. And it doesn't, but it does happen. Now, although not necessarily leaders, some who have tried to go through the Alcoholics Anonymous program and some who completed it then turned their backs on it and were co-opted by other programs or their philosophies, which were not just different, but were really in opposition to AA. So the third kind of formal social control, let's try that again. Jennifer's just stumbling today. The third kind of resistance to social movements is formal social control. And when you think about social control with a movement, this is really what we automatically picture, right? Although formal social control can take place in a variety of ways. And one is legitimate force, which is just what it sounds like. Police officers, soldiers, that kind of thing. Why do we think of this automatically? Probably because this is the kind of control that receives the most attention. You see it on the news at night or read about it in the paper. And in current society, because of technology, we can even watch it as it's happening. So we can actually watch protesters being sprayed with huge hoses or being forced back from where they are by a line of policemen or people dressed in riot gear. We can actually see tear gas being fired into a crowd in real time. But it's different because in the past, this is something that the majority of society just didn't question for a few reasons. First, because in the past, the majority of society really did have an implicit sense of trust in the authorities. It really was a widespread assumption that if somebody was being pursued or arrested, or even just questioned by the police, there must be a valid reason for it. Because, they're the police after all. They're the army. They are riot police, after all. They're a SWAT team. That's what they do. I don't think anybody really looked at them as having all powerful, unquestioned authority so they could do whatever they wanted. But at the same time, they were always given the benefit of the doubt. So long as they were not too excessive, the use of this kind of force to alter or resist, or sometimes completely stop people, was considered okay. It was considered legitimate. But in many ways, for many people, legitimate force is no longer viewed that way. Its legitimacy and the people enforcing legitimate force is no longer automatically viewed as legitimate. The focus is now on questioning whether legitimate force stays within certain boundaries. And instead of automatically not questioning this, it is now automatically questioned, aided by cell phone videos. And as you know, because you haven't been living under a rock for the last 10 years, what is considered legitimate force can be subject to a very wide degree of interpretation. But also note the line from the textbook that says, this allows elected and appointed officials to use the police and other agents of control within limits for their own purposes. So stop for a minute and think about what that means. This is a huge criticism of Donald Trump, that he seems to view the various branches of the American government and the people that work within it as his own personal minions. Now, another kind of formal social control is over-enforcing existing laws or creating new ones. So there's a rally or a protest of some kind. It's completely peaceful and organized and respectful. It doesn't obstruct traffic or really bother anybody else in the area. But people are detained and arrested because of public nuisance bylaws or loitering bylaws, or they're just given a ticket for jaywalking. In other words, let's be honest, the police are specifically instructed to act like jerks and enforce laws and ordinances that would usually never be enforced. Maybe a city council will suddenly pass a new ordinance stating you cannot have gatherings over 20 people in certain areas of the city, or at certain times of the day, or in certain days of the week. Maybe they'll pass an ordinance against signage. Signs are completely disallowed in certain areas or on certain buildings. Or there's new restrictions placed on the sizes of signs, or the size of lettering on them, or the coloring of lettering. In the Deep South in the US, during the fight for civil rights by African Americans, this was done all the time. Over enforcing laws and ordinances, but in a selective way. And this was widely and routinely used as an intimidation tactic. Pulling over somebody's car several times a day to check for proper ownership and insurance. Getting a ticket issued because the car was too loud. But think back to what we just discussed regarding legitimate force and the line from the text that states, this allows elected and appointed officials to use the police and other agents of control within limits for their own purposes. So, for example, during the Civil Rights Movement, Harry Byrd, who was the senator of Virginia, with others, united white politicians to campaign for state laws and policies to prevent public school desegregation. Some schools were shut down. They would purposely delay court proceedings to get them back open. So this was referred to as massive resistance, Virginia's massive resistance against desegregation. In reviewing the position of the Black Lives Movement, this is one of their main complaints in relation to racial profiling. Sure, police have every right to pull somebody over in their vehicle or to question somebody on the street if they feel there's just cause. But that's the problem. It's argued that many police officers will say they have just cause when they don't. And if it was a white person, they wouldn't do it. Another method of formal social control in terms of resistance to a social movement is violence. The most extreme kind of resistance to a social movement. Sometimes a last resort, but not always. And sometimes it's even used by authorities. So violence and resistance to a social movement may be specifically directed towards the leaders. And the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968 immediately comes to mind. This is what the picture is of. Dr. King was shot And the people are pointing to where the shot came from so that authorities can try to arrest somebody. Why? Because it was the people who did it hoped that with the leaders gone, the movement would lose speed and hopefully disband and fall apart. Although certainly with the civil rights movement, it didn't. Violence may be directed at anybody who participates in the movement at all, at a protest, or even against individuals in their home. When there's violence and resistance to a social movement, it may be coordinated, or it may be just a few people. I'm old enough to remember when the issue of abortion was still a really hot topic that would regularly be on the news every night. And sometimes the doctors themselves or clinic employees would be attacked at work at the clinics, or during pro-choice protests, or even in their homes. In 1994, John Britton, a physician, and James Barrett, who was a clinic escort, were both shot to death outside the Ladies' Center in Pensacola, Florida. So when you hear the word escort used in regards to an abortion clinic, what that means is because of protesters, employees would be escorted in and out of the building by security, as would people who were there to make use of clinic services so that they could physically get into the building. That was in 1994. The same year, 2 receptionists were killed in 2 different clinic attacks in Brookline, Massachusetts. In 1998, Dr. Barnett Slepian, who you see here, was shot to death with a high-powered rifle at his home in New York. He had just returned from synagogue, where he was attending a memorial service for his father. And he was in his kitchen. He was getting soup ready when he was struck by a bullet fired through his kitchen window. The bullet very narrowly missed his son's head as it exited, and Dr. Slepian fell against his wife, who was right beside him. In 2009, Dr. George Tiller, a physician in Kansas who was nationally known for being one of the few doctors in the U.S. to perform late-term abortions, was shot and killed. And he had actually been shot once before in 1993. Dr. Garson Romulus, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, was a Canadian gynecologist who also specialized in providing abortions. He was attacked twice by anti-abortion protesters. He was shot in his home with an AK-47, and he was later stabbed. So violence in regards to resistance of social movements may be perpetuated by a large number of people against the movement, again, as what took place with the civil rights movement in the US in the 50s and 60s, or it may be individual people. But I want to make sure that you recognize that when violence is used, it's used for 2 reasons. First, clearly it's used on the person or persons to stop them, but it's also used as a tool of intimidation for anybody else involved in the movement or who is thinking of getting involved. So using the example of abortion doctors again, when these attacks against the doctors themselves or the nurses or the medical clinics were taking place, as I said, sometimes they were even targeted in their homes as well, with their family there. And this was openly put forth as a reason by some doctors and nurses who believed in a woman's right to abortion. But they were choosing not to do them because of the threat of violence, the feeling of intimidation. It was just too strong. During the 50s and 60s in the US, the level of intimidation and the consistency of intimidation for African Americans with the civil rights movement. Can we even begin to understand what that must have been like? If you go back a little further in history, when you look at public lynchings of African Americans, why were these people killed in this manner in such a public way? Why weren't they just shot? Because of the desired effect of intimidation. Seeing somebody hanging there and seeing the white people all around them laughing and consider it nothing, and often seeing the local authorities taking the same attitude and participating. So that's another example of resistance to a social movement. So it's not just to stop people, it is to intimidate them. You know, you haven't been attacked yet, but do you really want to take the chance and put your family in danger? Do you really want to put yourself in danger? So maybe it's better to just back off altogether. So, as I said, this is a pretty short chapter, but also one that's really important considering everything that's been front and center in our neighbor to the south regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. It's also directly relevant to us as Canadians when considering Indigenous rights and the reconciliation movement. It's really easy to watch the news or read something online or watch a quick video on YouTube and think, okay, now I understand what's going on. So make sure that you understand that with social movements, there's usually a long history that's occurred. And whatever the issue is, it has evolved into a social movement.